Okay, ready.
Right, I've got to mark this as well. Right, okay. As so many of us did of my generation, I left school with 6 O-levels, none of which included mathematics. So it would have been useless if I wanted to do a degree which involved any numeracy. I was only just 16. I'd met my future husband before I even took mock O-levels, and we knew that we were going to spend our future together. So university wasn't on the agenda. And I have to say that my late father told me he wouldn't have let me go anyway because I might have met the wrong people. I went to Henrietta Barnet, which was a pretty good grammar school, and there were about 70 of us in the O-level year. And yet of that 70, only about 16 stayed on for A-levels. So it just shows, in fact, the way in which people were, or women were regarded. I mean, you know, I was the first one when I finally got my first degree, first one in my family to actually get a degree in my husband's family. So I left school and my father sent me to secretarial college, a very good secretarial college. And I ended up getting a job with a company called Voice and Vision, which at that time was one of the main public relations companies in the country. And we had some very impressive accounts, including one which was the Pig Industry Development Authority, which was promoting the sale of pork. And I used to be called the little kosher pig because I was a Jewish girl working on a pork account, which everyone found very amusing. While I was at Voice and Vision, and I was very young, I was 17, 18, 19, I had a very go-ahead boss who sent me out to do things. So during that time, I met Johnny Dankworth, whom some of you have heard, met him at a cocktail party which I'd helped organize, and he took a wallet out of his pocket and he showed me, he said, look, he said, this is the woman I love and adore and I keep it next to my heart. And that was a picture of Cleo Lane, which was rather lovely. I met Frankie Vaughan. I met somebody who some of you may recognize, Dave Brubeck, the jazz pianist. And I worked on the pig account with a rather daffy lady called Jill Sallet, who was very county and very sort of not empty-headed, but not that down to earth. And we actually spent one whole day cooking bacon and selling it at the Ideal Home exhibition. But Jilly didn't go down that well, and eventually she was asked to leave. And my boss said, I don't know what will become of Jill, poor Jill, because what will she do? And about 15 or 18 years later, I used to read it was either the Saturday or Sunday Times, and there was a column in it. And I remember saying to my husband, you know, this woman writes exactly the same way that Jill Sallet used to talk. And that woman was Jilly Cooper. And so what was going to happen to poor Jilly, if any of you have heard of Jilly Cooper, was that she became a very, very well-known author, great mate of Camilla Parker Bowles, or as she is now, the Duchess of Cornwall. So my experience in public relations, I would say, was actually the best university training for a young person you could get. I have absolutely no regrets. But when I became pregnant with my first child, who is listening to me, so I'm being very careful, I left work to look after my family and bring up my family. But en route, because I wanted something to do, I actually took 2 A-levels at a college of further education and managed to get an A-level in history and an A-level in English. Shortly afterwards, my late mother passed away, and I had my father come to live with me, and I was rather at a sort of I suppose, a difficult time. And a friend suggested, why don't you do a degree? So I enrolled as a full-time student at Middlesex Polytechnic, it's now Middlesex University, and I took a degree in humanities, and I got a 2-1. Again, the first person in my family to get a degree. I mean, now it's taken for granted, everybody will. And I was at a loose end, and my husband said to me, oh, for God's sake, find something to do and occupy yourself. So I thought, well, right, I'll take another degree. I'll do a postgraduate research degree. And I've become quite interested in Russian Jewish history. So I thought I'd try and do a postgraduate research degree in the impact of Eastern European Jewish trade unionists on the English trade union movement. And a very well-known historian called Bill Fishman, whom some of you have heard of and some may not, Bill actually started research into the Jewish East End, recommended that I get in touch with somebody at the University of Warwick. And up I went, and I saw someone called Royden Harrison, who said, well, yes, we'll take you. They just started the Centre for the Study of Social History, and Warwick had just come out of being this rather revolutionary new university. It's now very well established, and I think part of the Russell Group, but in those days it had a lot of student uprisings and demonstrations. And what I soon found out was that Eastern European Jews had absolutely no impact on the English trade union movement, because there wasn't a trade union movement in Eastern Europe. And therefore, what I ended up researching was Jewish trade unions and comparing them with English trade unions in the clothing industry. So that set me up, and I did my research, and I got my MPhil because I had a supervisor who considered that I was just a middle-class housewife passing the time of day, and it really wasn't worth bothering with me. And 5 weeks before I was due to submit my thesis, he suggested, I think you ought to look at the Yiddish press. He had absolutely no idea that the Yiddish press was written in Hebrew and was largely German. Fortunately, again, my father hadn't believed that his daughter needed to go to Hebrew classes. I did 1 year's Hebrew, and I actually managed to go to the newspaper library and go through the Yiddish press, read and translate. And then I found a wonderful Hebrew Yiddish teacher, Esther Held, who lived not far away. She was a translator for the government. And I do all my translating in the newspaper library, then I take it along to Esther, and I'd say to Esther, is this correct? And she corrected it, so that if you ever read my book, Uniting the Tailors, all the translations from the Yiddish press are actually accurate. And the Yiddish press I looked at was the anarchist press, because that was the paper for the Jewish trade unionists. So I actually did a comparative study of tailoring in London and Leeds. And during this period, I met a small group of PhD students who would later become very well-known historians, because at the time I was doing it, Anglo-Jewish history was the thing. Everybody was beginning to look at not the very sort of Cecil Roth upper-class Jewish history, but the Jewish working class history, driven by Bill. And then there was someone called David Feldman, who is now the Pears Fellow of Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck. David Cesarani, whom some of you may have heard of, the late David Cesarani, sadly, he died very suddenly. Someone called Brian Shyatt, who wrote about the interpretation of the Jew in English literature. And Ricky Berman, who at that time was setting up the Museum of the Jewish East End, which then became the Museum of Jewish Life in London. And we used to meet about every month and discuss our research. And the two Davids and Brian got their PhDs, and I got my MPhil because, as I say, my supervisor never really bothered very much. And there I was, and I thought, well, what am I going to do now? And Ricky Berman actually said to me one day, I'd become a trustee of the Jewish Museum, and Ricky said, look, I want to take a year's sabbatical rather. Would you stand in as curator? And by that time, my children were getting grown up, very grown up. Deborah was about to go to university. James was at over 13, so he was at school. And I thought, well, I know nothing about curating, so why not have a go? And I then took over running what became and is now the Jewish Museum London, in the attic of in East Finchley, in the attic where the head office is and still is the Reform movement, which was to take me into another area. And I don't know if any of you went to the Jewish Museum when it was in the attic, but it was you had to climb 2 very steep flights of stairs, and it had displays of a tailoring workshop and various archival items that had been collected mainly from the East End. And I was sitting in my office one day, and a gentleman came in, and I'd published a little booklet. And he said to me, this is really interesting about, the tailoring trade. He said, I grew up in Leeds. And he said, one has to be very careful when one's on Zoom. And he said, sorry. And he said, I said to him, there were a lot of tailoring companies in Leeds. I said, that there were 100 or more. What was your father's name? I might have heard of him. And he said, Burton, Montague Burton, and egg on my face. But the guy I'd spoken to was Raymond Burton. And he was so concerned that Jewish London life be preserved that Raymond decided that he would actually make a huge donation to enable the amalgamation of the Jewish Museum and also the Jewish Museum of which I was curator, and the Jewish Museum in Woburn House, which had all the artifacts and precious silver that was the history of London and British Jewry. And he donated, I think it was, and this was 1988, about £1 million to buy a building in Camden, which is now Raymond Burton House in Albert Street, and set up, which is now the Jewish Museum, London. And I'll come on to a little bit more of that in a while. And whilst working at the museum, of course, the head of Reform Judaism, the main body, was downstairs with Raymond Goldman as its executive director. And I went down to Raymond one day and I said, Raymond, I'm doing some research. I said, have you got a history somewhere of the Reform movement? Because there is confusion that it emanated from German Reform Judaism, which I'm not sure about. I don't know. And Raymond said, well, no, there's no clear history. Would you like to write it? And I said, well, I'll have a go because I'm a historian. I like history, but I really don't know that much about religion, and the in-depth details. He said, well, I'll tell you what, there's a young rabbi who's taking quite a long time to finish his PhD, but maybe he'd like to write it with you. Maybe I can put you in touch with him. A young rabbi called Jonathan Romaine, of whom some of you may have heard. And I think Jonathan was at that time married to Sybil, who of course was the rabbi at Wimbledon and the mitzvah Deborah's son and my grandson, Deborah and Paul's son and my grandson. So I actually got in touch with Jonathan and we got together, and the result was the book that tells the story of Reform Judaism from the 1840s to I think we published it in 1995. So it took it right through, and I did the original historical research, and Jonathan did more of the institutional research. And some of you may have seen it, but it should be on the bookshelves of Wimbledon Synagogue and all synagogues, and we do refer to it occasionally. And that started a very good relationship with Jonathan, whom we all know and I think admire, and he's been a very staunch supporter of mine in our family's times of need. At the same time, I put on 2 exhibitions at the museum. One was called A Refugee from Nazism, which told the story of one woman who came over as a refugee from Nazi Germany. And the other was about the clothing industry, called Off the Peg. But an interesting incident occurred with Refugee from Nazism, because it was that time that there was Elizabeth Maxwell, Robert Maxwell's wife, was doing a great thing about remembering for the future, and she was using our exhibition as a backdrop. And we were short of about £700 or £800 for funding for the exhibition. So I wrote to Robert Maxwell, who was a friend of Sigmund Sternberg, and said, dear Mr. Maxwell, your wife Elizabeth is using our exhibition as a backdrop for her talks, and we really are in need of a little bit more funding. I wonder if there's any chance that you could, help out. And I got a letter back, which is somewhere in my files, which says, thank you very much for your letter. And I was Mrs. Kershen then, not Dr. Kershen. That's not Dr. Kershen. I'm afraid I have no money. And I took it home to my husband and I said, look, I've just had this letter from Robert Maxwell and he says he's got no money. And this was quite a while before he disappeared and they discovered he really didn't have any money. So somewhere in my files is a letter from Maxwell actually explaining that the condition was not very good. So that was another of the experiences along the way on my journey. So I got from Mayfair to East Finchley. I finished my year at the museum. Ricky came back and took over, and we subsequently began to build it up. And I think some of you may have been there. And I remained a trustee for a number of years till I moved out of London. And I don't know whether you know that we managed to get Prince Charles to be the first patron of the Jewish Museum. It was actually the first museum of which he was ever appointed a patron. And we had a very nice sort of small meeting of about 20 of us when Prince Charles and Camilla came to visit the museum just after it had been in its early stages, but amalgamated with the Jewish Museum in Woburn House. And we all stood in little groups, and Charles and Camilla came in, and I was in a group with 3 other people. Prince Charles came up and said, obviously he does this to break the ice. He said, heard a really dirty story in New York last week, but I can't tell it here. And I thought, And then we'd got some kosher biscuits, and as he was leaving, Wendy Levine, Lady Levine, who brought him, said, oh, sir, would you like one of these biscuits? And he took one. He said, oh, this is delicious. So Wendy said, oh, would you like to take some home? So Prince Charles said, well, how? So Camilla got a serviette, opened it up. She said, look, you put the biscuits in the middle. You fold the serviette over like this, turn it over, put it in your pocket and eat them in the car on the way home. So that's how our kosher biscuits traveled to Clarence House. And I then was going to make my journey down to the Mile End Road. Again, I have to say in all this, I've only ever had one job interview. And that job interview was for my position in the public relations company when I was 17. I have never had a job interview since. Things have just happened, which is quite wonderful, because when I'd finished at the museum in the February, I had a phone call from Professor Bill Fishman saying, look, we've got a problem. David Cesarani has taken an appointment in Manchester and we're left without anybody to run what is a very, very popular course called the Politics and Society of East London. Bill Fishman had retired and he said, I'll help you with the lectures. Will you take over? Will you come and join the Department of Politics at Queen Mary? And I thought, I know nothing about lecturing, I know nothing about curating, but I'll have a go. And I went. I suppose I was a bit apprehensive, and the courses were very popular. And Queen Mary was situated, as some of you will know, down the Mile End Road, still is today. And I joined the Department of Politics, which at that time had only 7 people in the department. It is now the School of Politics and International Relations and has a cast of about 50, and I know very few of them. The first year went very well. It seemed that I got on with the students. I think if you can communicate and connect, as I discussed with one of my neighbours who was a teacher, it works well. And they asked me to stay on and gave me the position as Barnet Shine Senior Research Fellow. And I stayed. And I began to realise that, all right, East End Jewish history was very interesting, but Queen Mary was situated in the East End of London with a very large population of Bangladeshis, and it had a history of immigrants. And I suggested that we all really ought to, at that time, this was about 1994, set up a centre for the study of migration so that people could actually come to Queen Mary and we could connect people who were actually working in the field of migration. Because even today, there is no discipline such as migration. Although a lot of people are involved in studying different aspects of it. and this was approved, and actually the Centre for the Study of Migration, of which I was director until I retired in, I think, 2011 or 12, is still going strong. I held a number of conferences, and from those conferences, I produced edited volumes. I'd also produced in this time a number of self-authored books, one of which was Strangers, Aliens and Asians, which looks at the history of Huguenots, Jews and Bangladeshis in the East End. And my edited volumes are now a series with Routledge, who are the biggest academic publishers in the country. And its series is Studies in Migration and Diaspora. And the series now runs to about 90. At the moment, we've got about 5 going through the process of publication. We started publishing them in about 1998. But it's grown. I have proposals from all over the world now, and I just finished editing a book that's coming out probably early next year on the plight of refugee women. And I don't think we realise how hard it is and how abused and harassed women who seek refuge and are taken into refuge are actually treated, even when they are actually in supposedly safe places. They are raped, abused and treated badly. And this book was quite an eye-opener for me. As well as that, it became known, A, that I specialised in the tailoring trade, and that got through to the media. So I have done a number of radio and televisions. I've done two Who Do You Think You Are? One with Esther Ranson some years ago, which was very amusing. We did that in the East End, or my bit was with her in the East End. And as we walked down the market, which was Petticoat Lane, everybody's shouting out, "Hello, Esther." And I must say, she was great in responding. She was very tough to work with, very demanding. And I have to say, she had this little man that came with her that adjusted her makeup every half hour to make sure that her mascara was right and her lipstick was right and whatever. And I turned around to him and I actually said, "Look, I feel very, very uncomfortable. I've got no makeup on at all." He said, "I'll give you a bit of lipstick." So it made me feel a little bit better. The last Who Do You Think You Are? I did was with Kate Winslet, who's a lovely, lovely lady. But the BBC kept it a secret. They wouldn't tell me who it was. And I have to be truthful. She was an A-star or whatever they call the Hollywood stars. And they were very keen to get her, but I think they had a bit of a job finding something really, really good to talk about with her. So I've done quite a lot of things on the tailoring trade. I did a program up in Leeds on the Jewish community of Leeds about 2 years ago. And we started off in Leeds Market. I don't know if any of you have ever been. It's a fabulous 19th century market. It's where Marks and Spencer started off. And then the producer had this idea that we actually film in a factory, which was turning frying oil into diesel. And when we got there, I said, "Well, I'm not walking through this oily factory." So they gave me something to put over my shoes. And we went up this rickety staircase, got up to the first floor, and it was almost pitch black. I mean, as somebody said to me, health and safety didn't come into it. Got to the first floor and I said to the producer, "There are rat droppings." He said, "Don't worry, it's absolutely fine. We're going upstairs." And we went upstairs and we did the interview, and I talked about the history of tailoring trade and the exploitation of Jewish tailors. And as I'm talking, I looked and there is this large, dark rodent crossing behind the guy with the camera. And I said, "I'm not saying another word till you get rid of that rat. There is no way I can do anything with a rat walking around." And we sat there for about 5 minutes while he chased this rat round. So it's not glamorous. It's not glamorous at all, I have to say. And there have been quite a few other interesting experiences. Patricia, I'm getting to the end of my half an hour, and I've got down to the Mile End Road, and you can see I've done the reverse journey. And it's been a very exciting one. And my late husband and I retired down to West Sussex 5 years ago. And when I was very suddenly widowed, I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'm editing my books. And I joined the local U3A, which some of you may have heard of. And during lockdown, I gave weekly lectures on Zoom on just history, immigrant history. I used up absolutely every piece of material I'd ever given and taught, because as academics, you run a course maybe for a term or even for a year, which is 24. I did 30, and I'm starting again in September. So I think it's been an interesting journey, and it's one that I loved history from the age of 6, but I never ever set out to become an academic. Oh, I got my PhD by published works, by the way, which is very unusual. But it was suggested that because I'd published a number of self-authored books and a number of journal articles, it was an unusual but quite important way of getting it. So I got the PhD as well. So from a public relations semi-executive meeting with Johnny Dankworth, I suppose I ended up down the Mile End Road, but also meeting some very, very interesting academics and other personalities. So there we are.
That was a wonderful, wonderful talk, Anne. And have you got time to answer a few questions?
Yes, I have. Yes. If anybody's got any, yes.
Unmute yourselves. Anyone who wants to ask a question, do. Okay, let me start. I know you're not really retired because you're still doing lots of things, but presumably you have more time on your hands now than you used to. So how do you fill your spare time?
Well, I think, you know, Patricia, I've sort of health-wise had a bad month. I've made some friends down here. I really spend time reading, writing, preparing the lectures, and when I can, I'll take a trip down to the sea and walk by the sea and walk along the shore, which is wonderful. And when I can, I'll go up near you and see my children, and the time seems to pass. So you know, I suppose my hobby is my interest in history, and when it's cold in the winter, I knit.
Do you? Right. Anyone else got a question? Paula.
Okay. I mean, Anne, you have had quite a career, quite a journey, but I'm really interested to know how you managed all that and raised a family. This is not an easy call. Was your husband a stay-at-home husband? Did he look after the kids while you were studying? I mean, you went up to Warwick. Where were the, you know, even though you had a daughter who I think was going to university.
My daughter is with us, so I have a comment.
You might have something to say.
I don't think she will. Well, to begin with, no, my husband was certainly not a house husband. In fact, as Deborah will remember, he was very much involved with his work, very, very much so. And it was me that ran the central heating, etc., etc. But I didn't work from when Deborah was born until, well, I suppose you could say work was when I was running the museum. Yes, I did my postgraduate degree at Warwick, and we lived at the bottom of the M1, and I'd get in the car after lunch and drive up to Warwick and attend a seminar or a tutorial, then drive back down again and make supper. And I was seen at times, and I think it was Patricia said she'd done, I never got caught, but I was seen. Middlesex Polytechnic was about 10 minutes from where I lived, and I was seen by some people driving very fast down the A41 to go home in between lectures to make my father his lunch. So I hope that my children and my family never really sort of suffered from my other activities. I fitted them in.
But I have one more question. Okay, but when you're doing research, and that means it takes time, and that means you have to access libraries and all the rest of it. And you need peace and quiet. I know that I was studying when my kids were doing their O and A levels, and it was not easy. You know, you just had to try to find a space where you could have some peace and quiet and stop worrying about what they were doing. So that's why I'm intrigued about how you managed to fit it in.
Well, first of all, I think we all had space. I had a study. Children had their rooms. I spent wonderful hours in the British Library, in the reading room that was in the British Museum before they moved it and built the big British Library. And that was a wonderful place to go. You could actually park outside for up to 4 hours if you fed the meter. And you went into the British Library, the reading room. You can't even get in there now. I think it was octagonal. And nobody spoke, nobody could get you. And I would spend a day there, maybe 2 days a week, just walk through the British Museum to get a bit of lunch, and then walk back to the reading room. And so I managed to do the research that way. I went up to Leeds to do research. I'd go for the day. But as I say, the children weren't babies. My late father was alive, and he was looked after to an extent. He was quite capable. Well, we won't go down that road. But no, it wasn't really a problem, I have to say. I was lucky. And my husband, supported me. Well, when I took my first degree, Harold Wilson had actually made it possible for those who hadn't had the benefit of going to university straight from school. You could go and you didn't have to pay in those days. My first degree, I didn't have to pay for, and I automatically got a minimum grant. There was no mean above a certain amount. I think it was £450 to pay for books. I mean, which, we've gone completely the other way. Then you applied for a grant. So my first degree, I didn't have to pay for. My MPhil, yes, I paid for. And when I did my PhD by published works, and was supervised by somebody called, his name's gone, but it'll come back to me. He was Vice Chancellor, Jewish historian. Jeffrey Alderman. Anybody heard of Jeffrey? And I saw Jeffrey twice. I had to write an accompanying thesis with my books, which I did in 3 months. And that needed, I think by that time, Deborah was living away from home. James was self-sufficient. And I wrote that, and I saw Jeffrey twice. And he rang me up one day, he said, if anybody knows Jeffrey, he said, Anne, he said, I have a problem. There's 2 points. I thought, oh God, what is it? He said, on page 86, you've missed out a comma. And on page 102, I want to put in an and. And then I went and had a viva, which I was terribly nervous about. And I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my husband I was doing it till about 3 weeks before, and nobody else knew. I don't think you knew, Deborah, till I'd got it. And I had the viva, and a viva is a really nerve-wracking thing. I mean, when I have to examine PhDs, I get nervous for the students. I feel terrible about it. And I walked in, and Jeffrey was there, and there was a huge plate of Danish pastries and coffee and tea. And he said, I want to tell you, Anne, you've got it. Now we'll ask some questions. And the 2 examiners were a lovely guy, 2 guys. You may have heard of Professor Tony Kushner, who's at Southampton, who's done a lot of work on refugees and Jewish history, and the late John Clear, who was a professor at UCL. And they had questions, but Jeffrey answered all of them, and we just sat there and laughed. So that was my viva. I mean, it was quite an experience. But to get back, Paula, yes, I had no problems, actually. I was able to get the work done.
You were lucky.
I was. Well, I had a good family around me. Anyone
else? No? Okay, well, all I can say is thank you very, very much for what very interesting talk, which is on YouTube. So all the others who didn't appear in person, I'm sure will be listening to it on YouTube.
They're probably out enjoying the cooler weather.
Maybe, or else they've been struck down by the heat.
Yeah, one or the other.
Anyway, many thanks for talking to us. It was really great.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye. Thank you.